the Bridging Ideas Leadership Growth and Empowerment Center. We have an exciting session ahead. Our focus is on how surprise, mystery, and puzzles can enhance research impact. It's a fresh way to think, challenge assumptions, and see the unexpected in our work. Now I am honored to introduce Professor Karan Sonpar. He's a full professor of organizational behavior at University College Dublin, and also he's an associate editor of Human Relations, one of the leading journals in our field. His perspective is always thought-provoking, and it's making him the perfect speaker for today. Before we begin, a quick note on the questions and answers. Also, after the presentation, we will open the floor for questions. You can either type them in chat or use the raise hand button to ask directly also. We want this to be an interactive session, so don't hesitate to join the discussion. Now, without further delay, Professor Sonpar, floor is yours. Can we start?
Thank you so much, Pelin and Meryl. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you all. I've been to Istanbul twice and I absolutely love the city. And as per my parents, it's the greatest city on earth. So I really love Istanbul and I really look forward to interacting with you all today. Now, in terms of this presentation, you're most welcome to ask questions along the way. You're most welcome to ask questions along the way. And what I'm going to talk about today is one perspective to research. This is not the only perspective. I want to be very clear about it. This is one perspective. This is one way of looking at things. And as an author or as an editor or as a reviewer, one of the things I have typically found is that at the end of it, people are just asking themselves one question. Am I reading something that interests or excites me? Is it interesting or is it boring? It comes to that. And if they find it interesting, they are willing to give you a chance. And if it isn't, they probably aren't. So that's my starting assumption. And I remember writing a paper many years ago. I wrote with my wife, who's also a professor. And we were doing some real complicated statistics. Not me, she was doing it. And saying, there is a survival bias, there is a sampling bias, there is this, there is that. I mean, we threw the kitchen sink in, put in a lot of work for almost a year and a half or two, submitted the paper. And the editor came back and the reviewers came back. Okay, we don't entirely agree with your analysis in terms of your argument. But even if this was accurate, the answer you've come up with is almost identical to what prior people have come up with. So yes, you're saying there's a sampling bias, there's a survival bias, but at the end of it, you've come up with a fairly similar answer. So what? Why is this interesting or why does this matter? So that was my starting point. It was as a PhD student. And along the years, I've started increasingly believing that if you're not excited or interested in something, you probably cannot excite or interest others. Now, I'm going to start with two very simple examples. And these examples come about a topic which all of us are interested in. Either we love it or we hate it. And that topic is money. So I'm going to share two examples. And this is from a book. There are two books. The first book is a book called The Psychology of Money. It's there in all airports. It's there in all airports. And in this, I mean, the chapter number 1, you can just see the quote which is written over here. I find it so brilliant. If you see this quote, what does this person say? Your personal experiences with money make up about 0.0001% of what is happening in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works. That's interesting. That's interesting or surprising because what the person is basically telling us is that we make suboptimal decisions. We make suboptimal decisions. The book speaks about suboptimal decisions and says in the end, you know what? If you are buying stocks, just buy the index. Just buy the index of stocks. Interesting, simple, straightforward point. Very simple, very clear, Very surprising. It seems surprising. Book number two. Again, I'm using a very simple example which everybody understands. This is a book very recently released. I'm reading it. And the name of this book is called Money. And what this book is basically saying is that money has value because we think it has value. Money has value because we think it has value. Money was backed by a gold standard. Money is not backed by a gold standard today. And across history, there have been bankruptcies and monetary disasters, and we are going for another one. Now, why have I started with these two examples? These two examples are interesting because they are talking about something that we can relate to our lives. We can relate it to our lives. The more we can relate it to our lives, the more we are interested in it. And the second thing about both these books are they are contradicting assumptions. We think we understand money. We don't. That's interesting. That's surprising. Whether it is cryptocurrencies happening today, whether it is currencies being devalued, whether it is questions on the dollar supremacy, it's all around us. That's interesting. It's around us. We think we understand it. We do not understand it. Now, let's get back to our lives now. Let's get back to our lives and the joys and tyrannies of being an academic. One of which being, writing papers and publishing. I think it is exciting to learn. I think it's really interesting and exciting to learn and upskill. That's the interesting part. The process can be a bit painful, particularly when it comes to writing our papers. And typically speaking, when we are looking at our papers as an author or when reviewers get back, these are the typical type of comments we get. These are the typical type of comments we get. The first type of comment we get very often is, I don't understand or believe what you are saying. I don't understand or believe what you're saying. To me, I would put almost 50% of the papers falling in this category, not more, actually 60 to 70% of the papers fall in this category. I don't understand what you are saying because it's very chaotic, it's very complex. There is no simple point. What are we saying? So the starting point of persuasion is making sure people understand what you are saying and people believe what you are saying. The next level, when it is coming to evaluation, is when we are talking of trying to persuade others, is people making a comment. Okay, you are saying that, this is happening, this is surprising. Well, this is surprising because you're using the wrong theory. It is not surprising when you look at the same phenomena from another theory. Or you claim to be writing about something, but this is not really the topic. This is not really the point. Let me share a simple example. So we were writing a paper and we were writing on fighter pilots. And there were two stories going on. Very high risk job. Now the question is, they face identity threats because if you're no longer flying as a fighter pilot, you lose your status. But at the same time, they face existential threats, which means it's a risky job and you can get injured or die also. So, what are you talking about? Are you talking about identity threats to your status? Or are you talking about existential threats to your life? That's an example of a type or issue that comes up. Now comes the start. Those are the starting points. Now comes the more interesting point where I am talking about my particular topic. Typically speaking, when we are writing a paper, this is one of those most common phrases. There are these killer bullets reviewers have in their revolver. This is one of those ultimate bullets you see in a revolver. 1 in 3 reviewers comes up with this. You are gap spotting. You are saying there is a gap in this theory, or people have said this, but people have not done that. But why does this matter? Why does this matter? You're not telling us why does this matter. This theory has seen this, but it has not seen this. So what? Why does it matter? Why does it matter? Next, when we send our papers for evaluation, why do people not buy the story or like it or find it interesting? There are too many different stories going on at the same time. We are hedging our bets. Like I'm writing the paper. Oh, there is a status threat. Oh, there is a life threat. It has to be about one. There has to be one story. My One of my PhD committee members, Professor Trish Ray, used to say something. One paper has one story. One paper has one story. What's the story you want to write about? An interesting paper typically has one story or one point. Like I shared that example of the book Money. We believe in money, and we believe in money because we think it has value. But it is a social construct. It is a social construct. It is not real. That's the story. And finally comes the point. What's new? What's interesting? Why does this matter? What's new? What's interesting? Why does this matter? Now, talking about academia as such, and our particular jobs, a reality of our jobs is that we operate in certain environments with certain assumptions. You may see a cat very quickly. This is the surprise or mystery or puzzle. He's 20 years old, so I apologize if he's coming in front of the screen. So there are certain norms in academia. But nobody tells us about them. We learn the hard way. My view is that we think academia as this interesting, exciting place, where 1,000 wildflowers bloom, where one can do anything and say anything. I wish the world was like that. Some of it is like that. We are getting a bit better, but in reality, we live in a very formalized and institutionalized system. There are people who can break the norm and write beautifully, and they get away with it, and it is very good. But sometimes we are unable to do so. We are getting better, but sometimes we are unable to do so. So, here are a couple of books which I'm just using them as examples of understanding our lives. If you're a early career researcher, you're a PhD student, assistant professor, postdoc, trying to do things, there are secrets. There are secrets. Nobody tells us they are realities. And I'm using two books as examples to make the point. There's a book written by Mary Douglas. She speaks about how institutions think. And if one was to assume that academia is an institution, the institution thinks in a certain way. People think in a certain way. There are certain norms, there are certain requirements. There was another book I read during my PhD. It's kind of interesting. It's called Invisible Colleges. And Invisible Colleges is about lots of little scientific communities, different groups of networks of people who look at the world in the same manner. They use the same language, they cite the same people, and they keep perpetuating their worldviews because they see the world in that way. And the irony of invisible colleges is that if you are not clearly aligned within one world group or one scientific community, you will get attacked by everybody because everybody understands you're not one of them. Like, for example, I was trained in North America, I was trained in Canada. I'm now in Europe. A North American approach to qualitative research can be slightly different from a continental European and a British perspective writing on research. Now, as soon as you try to go across communities, all of a sudden people start going for you and attacking you with different worldviews. That's a reality. I'm learning to navigate it a bit better, but the reality is we live under constraints. Now let's talk about ourselves, writing papers. When we are talking about writing papers and trying to have a wow factor, whether it's, I mean, of course, acceptance is a requirement for our lives, but let's put that beyond, say, writing a paper which makes us happy, which makes you feel good. You know what? Oh, I did something. I'm very happy I did it. Makes you feel good about it. What makes research good? What are people looking for when they are reading your paper? The first and foremost criteria is plausibility. Plausibility is, do I believe it? Do I believe what you are saying? Plausible. Oh, this is a plausible explanation. This is why it is happening. I trust you. I believe you. Do people believe your findings or do people believe your arguments? The second level is important. Why does this matter? For example, we had the president of Academy of Management. He does his thesis, he does his work on alcohol use, right? And at the Turkish Academy, he says, you know what? I said, this is important because people will die. You know, importance. You're saying this is an important phenomena because of this reason. When it came to that book money, it is important. Why? Because it affects our lives. It affects our lives. It affects our savings. It affects our retirement. So the next thing is importance. It is important. It could be practically important, or it could be important because influential people believe that this is worthwhile. Influential people believe that this is worthwhile. There's a Matt Alverson who's saying it, for example. Brilliant, outstanding scholar, outstanding researcher, right? When people who have great credibility are talking about something, maybe it matters. The third level, which I find even cooler, is interesting. Is it interesting or not? Interesting is a bit surprising. Why are things interesting? Things are interesting because they are a bit surprising. Oh, we don't understand money. Oh, I'm very sharp. I'm going to do this. We don't understand money. We don't even sometimes realize it's a social construct. And societies, empires and after empires have gone bankrupt, not backing their currency with a gold standard. That's interesting because it contradicts common sense. We don't believe that this can happen. And then there's a final level. This is the secret level. I think this is the most beautiful level. Carl Weick, you all must have heard of Carl Weick. He speaks about theories that move us, something that touches our heart, something that gets an emotional response in us. That becomes interest. That becomes very persuasive. You've got a compelling empirical site. Your reviewers probably want to read it. Your reviewers probably want to read it. There's this article, and you must have heard a reference to this article by almost any speaker talking about research. It's a beautiful article. It's by Davis Murray. It's called That's Interesting. That's interesting. Now let's go back to history. I think I was reading it in Time magazine or in one of the magazines. It was quite interesting. They spoke about among the three greatest thinkers of our times are Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Albert Einstein. And they have come up with theories, or elements of their theories are not entirely accurate or been accepted by the scientific community. And yet they've had such a powerful impact. Yet they've had such a powerful impact. So the point is, interesting matters. Interesting matters because interesting denies assumptions. Interesting contradicts assumptions. Interesting denies assumptions. Interesting contradicts assumptions. Interesting denies assumptions. Interesting contradicts. Let me share one example. Herminia Ibarra. She writes about identity. She writes about identity, and what does she say? Being authentic or being yourself is the worst piece of career advice you can ever follow from anybody. You should be inauthentic. You should be playful. You should experiment. You should copy mercilessly from multiple role models. Now that's interesting. right? Because we are always told, just be yourself, just be authentic. She's saying the opposite. That's interesting. That's interesting, which contradicts how we speak about things. But when you look at it, you actually realize that, you know what, it makes sense. Let me share an example. A few days ago, I was giving a talk in India to some military audience, fairly senior people. And they were saying, they asked us, Karan, tell us one thing. We have some people who work with us and they're really nice people. But as soon as they go up the hierarchy, they go bad. You know, these very good people become almost like a part of the establishment. And why do people go bad? And how do we stop it? And how do I not become like that when I rise? And my answer to them is number one is people don't go bad. And number two, they are doing the right thing by changing. Because your identity has to match your role also. You need to evolve. The vantage point is changing. That's a very Herminia Ibarra argument. That's interesting. That's interesting. Authenticity is not necessarily good. That's interesting. So what? Now, what can we do about it? So, I've given you a bit of background by saying in the beginning that when people are reading our work or evaluating our work, there are a variety of things they are looking for. Do I believe your story? Are you saying something important? But apart from that, what they're looking for is that, oh, this is something new. Oh, I didn't think of it this way. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I buy it. It's interesting. So, what can you do about it in your careers? Now, again, as I shared with you all, this is one perspective. This is one perspective. There are many perspectives to do research. One perspective to do research could be, for example, become an expert with a narrow theoretical domain. Professor Arnold Baker, superstar, within a domain, building it block by block, piece by piece, specifying it. This is another way of looking at things, what I am trying to say. So, going for talks, I haven't attended many of them, to be very honest. I'm a very bad conference attender of talks. But I remember going for one talk which really grabbed my attention, and it was not even a talk, it was the Academy of Management Doctoral Student Seminars. And Professor Andy Wen spoke about research. And he says, you can look at research as a triangle. There is theory, there is method, and there is phenomena. Theory could be, oh, I'm an institutional theorist, and we do not know much about agency from low status actors. For example, you're trying to start with a theory, you're trying to start with a gap or a conversation within a theory, and using that as a starting point to come up with your empirical setting or your theoretical argument. So you're starting with the theory first. That's how we are typically taught how to do research in our PhDs. What is the theory? Try to figure out, do a literature review, and so forth. That is one way to think of it. Another way to look at research is method first. Method first. Now, you must have seen there are, for example, some people, they do bibliometric analysis. They are experts at bibliometric analysis. So, bibliometric analysis in mergers, bibliometric analysis in psychological safety, bibliometrical analysis in this journal, bibliometrical analysis in the 1990s, right? They are using method, they know the method, they have the hammer, and then they start looking for any nail around which they can use their skill to do their research. Can be another effective way. That is using method first. You have a skill. Now you try to identify a situation where you can use your methodological skill. A third way to look at research is to look at phenomena. And a phenomena could be something that is happening in the real world around you. It's happening in the real world around you, and it has grabbed your attention because there's something interesting going on over there. Let me share an example of phenomena. Now, for me, and Van de Ven said it, starting with the phenomena first is probably the easiest and best way to do research. It's the easiest way because you find a phenomena is generally grabs your attention because it is interesting. A phenomena grabs your attention because it is interesting. Otherwise, you won't notice it. There are so many things happening, but we notice something, right? We notice something. That's why it's grabbing our attention. So I was in India a few days ago. I told you I was talking with the military guys. I was walking into a place and it was fascinating. There were boards and there were quotes, and all the boards and all the quotes were from Indian history. There was little or no mention of the British Empire, right? Little or no mention. Now, when I was back in India 20 years ago, it was different. Now, all of a sudden, it has changed. I gave a talk and I received a gift, and the gift I received was this book. It's brilliant. The title is An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. Now, I'm just trying to create a storyline out of this. Now, for me, the interesting part when I was looking at this entire phenomena is when I was a captain in the Indian Army, we really valued the traditions. I came from a school called Prince of Wales Royal Indian Military College, ostrich feathers. You know, in the military, we really valued our traditions. A lot of it came from the British military days. All of a sudden, what was a symbol of status has become a symbol of stigma. Now that's interesting. How do symbols of status become stigmatized? Why does it happen? That's an example of a phenomena. Building on this, I think I remember, and I'm going to be very honest over here. I was walking through the corridor, and every now and then you hear these conversations. So there was one of my colleagues, I remember this conversation. The person like, "Oh, I love doing research. I really love doing research." I was like, "Oh gosh," I mean, that sounded really odd to me. It sounded quite odd to me. Okay, I can understand. I like publishing, having seen my name in a good journal, or oh, I was speaking with interesting people, or my student did really well. I like that. But I love doing research. I mean, research, parts of research are fun, but most of them are pain. Let's be real about it. Some elements are fun, a lot of it are quite painful. And the question is for somebody like me, how do I make my research less painful? That's how I would like to look at it. I do something which I enjoy doing and minimize a bit of the aggravation also. I mean, writing is fun at times, but it is a pain a lot of the times. Reading is fun sometimes, but going through the process of identifying articles or understanding what is written can be painful a lot of the times. So here are some things I found working for me. And again, I'm saying, looking back at your lives, I think the best way to look at interesting for me personally is look at what's happening around you. Look at what's happening around you. There are lots of interesting things happening around you. I was again back in India. I go back to the same barber shop, the guy who cuts my hair and, trims my beard. Very interesting guy, 22, 23-year-old guy. And he'll keep talking. He says, you know what? I come from this little village in Rampur in India. And me and these are all my cousins. And we sit and eat together. But I have another cousin in another day. And I'm going to open my own salon. Right? There is that aspiration. There is that story of aspiration happening. How each of these people is trying to help each other one out. And the way they look at their lives. There is aspiration. Things are happening around. I moved to Ireland in 2009, economic collapse, banking crisis. Economic collapse, banking crisis. What are we going to do? Am I going to have a job? Will I get my tenure? Why did I move to Ireland? I mean, I was in Canada. My dad looks at me and says, Karan, you did your PhD thesis on bad decision making and biases. You're the perfect example of it. You move from a very stable country and you go to a country which is in a crisis. That became an interesting empirical phenomena. Why did the banking crisis start? How is it possible that so much money was being lent? How is it possible that the big reputed banks started doing crazy things what everybody else is doing? How is it possible that the government did not see or the government did not stop the banks? It's happening around us. That's an example. Another example, I'm going to share one more of these ones. You're a early career academic, and at the end of it, one of the surprising things is whether you're in the military or in academia, anybody in a position of leadership is wrong or bad. That's very clear. No matter what, people are dean, department head, commanding officer, vice president, whatever it is, everybody's bad. We are right, these people at the top are bad. That's how we look at life. And sometimes, one would try to understand, like, why do these people make these strange decisions? Why do deans and department heads act so strange, at a very simplified level, making the decisions? And so we wrote a paper, we started interviewing deans and department heads. That paper got published in Journal of Management Studies. And it is about trying to understand the leadership schema of people in academic leadership roles. Leadership schema. It's around us. I was trying to understand the world around me. So my point is, your life is interesting. And a lot of your interesting life is happening outside the university environment where you're interacting with people. Start there. That may be an easy point. You're talking with people or you're studying phenomena that grab your attention. Next is, again, there are things happening around us, and there will be that one key moment. And you need to understand that key moment. There will be a key moment. So here's the first one, was banking crisis in Ireland. That was a human relations paper many years ago. And I was going through, what do you call, newspaper articles, annual reports, yada, 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 everything. Then why did the banking crisis happen? And then I was giving a talk to an executive audience. And then after that, somebody over coffee came to me and said, Karan, you don't really get it. It's not just about biases. We were facing so much competitive pressure to keep giving loans. Are you getting it? We were getting so much this. That was like the aha moment. And then I said, you know what? Let's start even doing more interviews. We just start doing interviews. And that was a theme that kept coming up. It's not about greed. It's not about biases only. There was a lot of competitive pressure, social comparison. I was doing a paper on former military officers and why do people leave the military and how do things work out for them voluntarily. And one of the interviews we were doing, there was a female military officer. She says, Karan, let's be clear. This was not voluntary. You may have had a full contract. I had a 5-year contract. At the end of it, it could be extended by 3 years or something like that. Is everybody following it? And I'm like, man, this was happening around me. It's not that I don't know it, but I didn't see it. That became the next paper. It just got into Journal of Management after I don't know how many years of pain and writing and rewriting and rewriting it. But that was the moment. That was the moment. Now that's interesting or surprising. It's like, how do people, how do they navigate their career journey? What does it mean? What does it mean to be in that situation? Department heads, again, deans and department chairs. I said, how do you manage high performers? Person looks at me, says, that's the wrong question. The correct question is, how do you create a high performance work culture? Again, my point, what I'm trying to say to you is that there is surprise around us. There is surprise around us, and the surprise does not come in these brilliant articles written in Financial Times top 50 journals. It's actually coming in the world around us. It's the people around us who are living their realities, who tell us their stories. And that can be a very powerful starting point. Next one, again, building on this point, is we are talking about when we are writing papers. I think one of the real important and difficult skills is you want to tell a story. But not only do you want to tell a story, you want to tell one part of a story. You cannot tell the entire story about everything. What part of the story do you want to tell? My colleague, she writes with us, brilliant academic professor. Her name is Mukta Kulkarni. Very smart, very well published also, very nice lady also, very smart person. And she says, what part of the story do you want to tell? You can't write about anything and everything. You want to hone it down to a part. Identify one little golden nugget and polish it. Like we were writing about the banking crisis in Ireland. Now, if I try to write about a paper on the banking crisis in Ireland, it's a disaster. You just can't do it. There's so much going on. And so, my wife Federica, she says, you know what? Why don't we break it up? How did aggressive banking start? Why did aggressive banking spread? Why didn't aggressive banking get deinstitutionalized? These are very clear, theoretically and empirically distinct aspects, right? They're theoretically and empirically distinct aspects. You try to write about everything, you just cannot. There is just a lack of depth. It's not clear enough. So I don't know, kind of, again, looking at this kind of a thing, let's just leave this particular one. Let's get to the next part. I love this one again. This is one of the ways I want to see it. So one of the beauties of sending a paper to the review process is when you send a paper to a journal, the editor-in-chief is trying to identify the correct associate editor, right? And the associate editor is trying to identify reviewers for you. And when they are identifying reviewers, generally speaking, they will identify reviewers from broadly within your tradition. But if you are trying to mix interpretive and critical or across traditions, it becomes very, very difficult. Different journals, different genres are different. And you cannot write a paper which will work for organization studies and journal of management at the same time. It probably won't. Or try to do it the same paper which will go to both journals. No. It becomes a bit harder. It has to be a bit more catered and distinct to the audience. So which audience will find it interesting? Which audience will find it interesting? For example, there's a fascinating paper written by, I think it was Andre Spicer and Matt Alverson. I think it's in Journal of Management Studies. And it is a critique on critical management studies. Very interesting paper. It's a critique on critical management studies. It says, okay, in critical management studies, we keep criticizing everybody. But let's take a look at ourselves. What do? We say the world is bad. We do not tell us so what. And we use other lenses and say, if we look at the world from this lens, this is what we see. Right? Now, if you're a critical management scholar and they do some of the most interesting work, you need to write for a critical management audience. But if you write it for a different audience, it will not work. So my point again over here in the prior slide is be very clear when you use words or you send to a journal. Who's your target reviewer? Who's your target reviewer? Everybody is not your target reviewer. Next, I love this one, is again getting to it. Again, something I received a reject, one of my very early papers. It was, I mean, we remember, I remember not all the good, do I remember all? No, not now, but the first few I remember. And I remember it was Professor, I remember she was Pratima Bansal. She was at AMJ. I'm not published in the journal, but very nice review letter. And she had written, and she says, you need to be clear about what is your golden nugget. There is too much going on in your paper. What is your golden nugget? And a golden nugget is one word, one phrase, one construct. One word, one phrase, one construct. That is your golden nugget. For example, again, getting to the book Money. Money has value because we think it's a social construct. That's the golden nugget. As a very interesting, I remember seeing a Bollywood movie, and I remember in that movie, there is a machine assembly line and that stops working. It's in a rural part of India many years ago. So one of the laborers says, my son is very smart. He may be able to fix it. So the owner looks at him, says, is your son an engineer? He says, no, my son is not an engineer, but he's smart. Anyway, long story short, It would have taken days for the engineers to come from the city. So the boy comes, he looks at the entire machinery, asks somebody for a hammer, goes to one part, hits it somewhere, and the machine starts working. Right? And then the owner says, how much will it cost? The guy says, it'll cost you $100. He says, what? $100 for hitting with a hammer? He says, no, for hitting with a hammer is $1. But for knowing where to hit is $99. And that's the golden nugget. That's the part you really need to get to in your paper. That's why sometimes it helps to have a good co-author or have a good editor or a good reviewer. They will tell you, you know what? This is interesting. Focus or here. This is interesting. Focus over here. So again, the thing over here is scratching and investing areas that lead to surprise, doubt, or similar feeling. Like, for example, we wrote a paper on fighter pilots, very interesting group of people. The interesting or surprising thing is they are not scared of death. They don't care about it. They don't think about it. Now, that's interesting or surprising. How is it happening? Why is it happening? Because the theory says there is death anxiety. But these people are not worried about it. They do not think about it. What's going on? Why is this happening? That's the golden nugget. It takes time. Next part, and I'm getting towards the very end also, maybe a couple of more slides or so, is that getting to interesting is a social process. It may not happen entirely by you. It almost never will happen due to you. It will happen due to people around you. There will be a reviewer, or there will be a respondent, or there will be a quote. They will be telling you stuff. Hey, Karan, you are saying this. I don't think this is what it is meaning, your data. I think what it is saying is this. Look at these quotes like this. Have you looked at this other way? So writing and research is a social process. It's a social process. And I actually found that having a slightly constructive attitude towards reviews leads to better outcomes. I mean, of course, there is that one odd reviewer who's just out to take the piss and you can do nothing about them. I'm not talking about them. But generally, I would put it as 1 in 5, maybe only 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 people who's just you pull the bad one. But it's not more than that. It's not more than that. They can be painful, but they may be painful for certain reasons. And so listening to your reviewers can be really helpful. Learning from them can be really helpful. Use their words. Try to understand what they are saying. Use their words. Because some of your reviewers, like I'm an associate editor, if it's a good paper, I spend a lot of time trying to send it to a good reviewer. And some of these reviewers are like superstars. They are superstars. They understand things. Some of them are senior scholars. They're like, you know what? They will tell you, you know what? This is interesting, or this is the part you want to focus a bit more on. I'm not telling that reviewers should write your paper. That's not what they should do. But they are colleagues some of whom can be constructive. Use their words, learn from them, listen to them. You may not agree with the solution they are giving, but you must listen to the problem they are identifying. What is the problem they are identifying? So to conclude, as a last slide, and we can open it up for conversations. Now we are talking about research and we are talking about the publishing process. And we can speak more about the internal mechanisms and dynamics of them. But I think being in a mid-career, I'll put myself a mid-career stage as such. Maybe I'm looking at things slightly differently, perceiving a bit more privilege. And I have been a bit more like that from the beginning. But what if we didn't look at publishing purely as a competitive sport, but you wrote papers on topics you enjoy writing about or you want to learn about? What if? What if you find a certain group of people interesting or a certain phenomena interesting? Makes your life easier. Makes your life easier to write it. Bores you a bit lesser. What if you made your life a bit easier by following some norms? Life's not fair. Every institution, every organization works under certain constraints. There are certain norms. Follow the norms within reason because it makes the process a bit easier. What if a published product was simply an end to an interesting journey? The journey mattering, learning something, reading something, listening to people. I actually believe it shows in the written product. If you've enjoyed something, it probably shows. You are more likely to be persuasive. People can see through. People can see through in authenticity quite clearly. And finally, what if theories could also be interesting and moving and not just, contributing to theory, but writing about things that make us understand our lives better. So that was my talk, and I'll open it up for conversations now. When it comes to the conversations, also, yes, I'm an associate editor at Human Relations. I'm happy to talk about that journal also. I'm also an associate editor at Journal of Business Research. Again, the requirements can be slightly different across journals. So any question is perfectly fair game. You're most welcome to ask them. Ozan, please. Yes.
Hi, Karan, thank you very much for this nice and interesting presentation and talk, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you every time. My question is related with the templates, like canvases.